My name is Jason.
My name is Tom.
And this is Fear of a Black Dragon, an old-school role-playing game podcast.
And in this episode, we are making murky plans in copper carbonate. It's Dark Designs in Verdigris.
Our first segment is the basic crawl.
Dark Designs in Verdigris is a 12-page game and setting by Richard Ruane, with illustrations by Minerva Fox, editing by Lauren McManaman, and published by one Jason Cordova, I think? Cordova?
I think that's right, yeah.
Yeah, is that right? It can be found as part of the Codex Gaming magazine in the issue entitled Emerald. Dark Designs in Verdigris is about the seedy underbelly of the Emerald City, and it begins with this intro. Oz had a taste for queer folks. It found the wizard and brought him here. It found Dorothy and brought her along too. You did not plan for Oz to take you, but then there were cyclones, angry mobs, gunfire, storms at sea, holes in the world you thought would bury you. And then you flew, and you belonged to Oz. Your monochrome life was over for good.
Now, before we go any further, we should note here that Oz, which is the classic L. Frank Baum setting, in this case is a kind of post-apocalyptic thing. That's kind of what's going on here. Ozma and her iron-fisted consort Dorothy have disappeared, and the Emerald City has long fallen to ruin. We aren't given a lot of details about what happened exactly, but that is very much the point. The citizens of Verdigris are literally and figuratively in the dark on a lot of things. The text begins with character creation, wherein you choose a name, your pronouns, your ability scores, you roll for some history questions, you select some queerly disturbing traits and queerly appealing traits, you choose a look, you choose something you cannot resist, you roll your hit points, you choose a form of sorcery, and then you choose a pack and you buy your possessions. Next up in the text is a couple of pages of rules. Dark Designs takes the best bits of OSR systems and smashes them up with World of Dungeons. And then the remainder of the piece features some guidance for running the game, some setting details, including adventure seed tables, information about the residents of Verdigris, and the strange beings known as the Phanphasms. Let's talk about how we have used Dark Designs in Verdigris. We should note here that this is the first system we have ever covered on Fear of a Black Dragon, and there's a good reason for that, which you're going to learn about in the Expert Delve. But Tom, have you played this?
I have not. I have only read it.
Indeed. I have actually run 4 sessions of it, and I'm also the publisher, so I'm pretty familiar. Let's talk about things we liked. This is the first system that we're covering on Fear of a Black Dragon. It's a system and a setting, right? And I actually do want to talk a little bit about the system as something I liked about it, because I think it's very, very good. I, of course, am a fan of World of Dungeons. No one listening to this podcast who's listened to it in the past will be surprised by that. But that said, it's more than just World of Dungeons, PBTA ideas mixed with OSR ideas. It's more than just Powered by the Apocalypse resolution with tables, right? It's not really that. It actually does a lot of really interesting mechanical things and actually strikes out into some what I think is some really interesting new territory. So more than any game I've played in recent memory, and this doesn't always come through in the text, but when you play it, you realize this. More than any game in recent memory, Dark Designs bakes a lot of storytelling into nearly every die roll. And I don't want to step on the Expert Delve too much here, but for example, if you try to rescue someone in this game, that's a special die roll. You actually have to say why that character matters to your character before you get to roll the die. If you use one of your traits to get a bonus on a die roll, you have to share a memory of when you learn that trait. And so as you're actually engaging with the mechanics, you're building out the story and the world as well. In play, it's really interesting. It's a very, very cool, it's a very mechanically cool game.
I liked that about it as well, because it's sort of partly in a slightly selfish way, because it reminded me of I have this sort of completely vaporware film noir game that I've sometimes playtested a bit, where I was trying to figure out how to get the visual motifs of film noir into a game that doesn't have any visuals, and I realized that the trick is that you make people describe in one situation, they have to describe the shadows that are in the room. In another, they have to describe a reflection or something that implies something before doing the die roll. And so I kind of saw that and thought, oh, yeah, okay, someone else has this excellent idea as well.
Well, it's interesting because I think that, like, the way that Richard ties in the asking of questions or the posing of questions, into the mechanics, that's not necessarily striking out into new territory mechanically. But I think it's much more explicit in a way that I haven't seen. In a lot of Powered by the Apocalypse games, which, for listeners who aren't aware, are games that have Apocalypse World by Vincent Mackay Baker as their sort of mechanical inspiration. In a lot of those games, it's kind of implied that the GM will be asking lots of questions, or that the players will be using die roll opportunities or die rolls as an opportunity to explore different aspects of the character, but it's not like baked into the rolls, right? And I think that's the difference.
Yeah, and so what I liked about reading through it, as well as the fact that it was nice and simple and effective, like I understood how to make a character straight away. It reminded me a bit of Into the Odd as well, with the nice use of, you choose what you're going to, you choose a background question and roll that kind of thing. I probably can't point to any single thing in there that's definitely Into the Oddish. But also, yes, having those baked in questions told me straight away what kind of, and again, let's not step on the expert delve too much, but it told me what kind of adventures I would be having when I played this game, which is great.
Another thing I liked is the character creation process. The character creation process in this game is probably one of the most effective I've done. And like I said, when you read the text, it's not as apparent, but when you actually do it, it really comes alive, because as you're creating your character, you are basically having to answer questions and discuss each aspect of your character as you roll them up, right? So it's not just that you're rolling up elements, for your character like you might in a regular OSR game, or picking things from a table, but you also have to speak to where these things came from. And not only that, but as you engage the process, you're also creating the world. And it's a really, really fascinating process. And by the time we were done with character creation, I felt really locked and loaded. I was like, man, I know exactly where to go with this. I had nothing prepped as far as like what I was going to do as the GM. But after character creation, I had like 10 different hooks and I was ready to go. And so it was super, super effective. I think the setting is light, but it's full of possibility. Within its 12 pages, a lot of setting details are hinted at, and with just a little bit of creativity, and I would say just the lightest sort of foreknowledge of the Oz books, you can sort of weave together a very convincing world on the fly, combined with that character creation process, which also seeds a lot of that information. So I really enjoyed that. It for such a slim text, it is surprisingly rich. I also liked the inclusion of GM principles, which is a very Apocalypse World sort of thing that you don't frequently see in OSR games. I don't recall seeing such things. I think a lot of that is in a lot of OSR texts, but it's not organized in a neat way, like a list of like GM principles for running the game. I found that very helpful. Anything else you want to say about what you liked about it?
Sure, yeah, I also liked the GM principles, although again, because it's the kind of thing I tend to agree with, I wonder if that's swaying me. And I also want to mention the artwork by Minerva Fox. There's only 3 illustrations? One of them in particular, though, showing the green Oz below city in a kind of cutaway drawing, so you can see the ruined city on the surface and then the still surviving city beneath. That was very nice and sets the tone excellently for what that remnant city might feel like.
Let's go to things we had questions about. So, Tom, go ahead.
Oh, sure. I mean, I just want to know what happened in your 4 sessions. How do these, these leading questions about character creation look great? What actual adventures did you have with your group?
Kind of picking up off what I said earlier about the character creation process. So what we did, the game has these tables of adventure seeds, and I picked one, and the adventure seed that I picked was the one that talks about this tiger who is preaching morality in the streets of Verdigris and is supposed to be in contact with Dorothy, because remember, Dorothy and Ozma have disappeared. And this tiger claims to be the sort of herald of the return of Dorothy, right? I use that as sort of core of my story. And during the character creation process, we learned a lot about the character's connections to various bosses of Verdigris. So what I did was I kind of quickly came up with an adventure that revolved around the bosses of Verdigris and how they felt about the return of Dorothy and what the implications were for them, right? And so then I used a technique that I call establishing questions, which are essentially very, very specific sort of loaded questions that kind of hook players into the stakes and into the story. I use those to sort of flesh out like, okay, well, you have a connection to King Cleaver, or you have a connection to the Witch Mombi. You know, what do they think about X, or what do they ask you to do with regards to Dorothy and X, right? Like, and so I kind of used that reappearance, that alleged reappearance of Dorothy, to sort of build out this kind of this sort of like structure of a story. And I was able to do that pretty quickly, actually. And then I just kind of riffed and just kind of played it by ear.
Yeah, nice. I mean, I do like those adventure prompts, actually, but I wondered if... I mean, they're atmospheric. In fact, all of my Chain Lightning stuff is just that. But were they, in and of themselves, do they have enough hooks in them to make players react to them straight away?
I would say, like, just in and of themselves, maybe not. But I think that discounts a major part of what's going on with this game, which actually flows into my question that I had for you. But a major thing that's going on in this game is Richard says that you don't need to know a lot about the Oz series of books to play this, and indeed you don't. But knowing something about The Wizard of Oz, knowing something about Return to Oz actually helps a lot because it helps like fill in some of the gaps, right? It gives you like kind of a baseline from which to work, right? And so my question for you actually is, in the UK, is The Wizard of Oz and Return to Oz as big a deal as it is over here? Because it's a big deal over here. And because it's a big deal over here, you can do a lot with this game with just your sort of cultural understanding.
Yeah, right. No, I don't think it is as big a deal as it is in America. Just because, I mean, The Wizard of Oz, the film, that's a well-known classic, definitely. But I mean, I've seen Return to Oz, and it's not very well known here, and I did feel when I was reading Dark Designs that I'm kind of getting some of this stuff just because I'm aware of what happens in Return to Oz, starring a very young Fairuza Balk, if I remember correctly.
It's Fairuza Balk, yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that is a good question. I don't think you need to even have seen The Wizard of Oz. I think you could just be aware of the penumbra of The Wizard of Oz's existence, and you'd still do okay. But you're right. I'm sure there are lots of references in there that I'm not getting, far beyond just the names of like Mombi and a couple of things I sort of half knew about from the later film.
I mean, Richard definitely approached the text with this perspective of you don't really need to know much about Oz. And indeed, a lot of the like little details that, I mean, I would say 90% of it is all made up, right? Like it's original to this, right? But that 10% that does like touch on, particularly Return to Oz, that's the one that, as far as films go, I think the one that's really relevant here. But also some of the Oz books. That 10%, even that's been remixed a little bit. You know, it's more referential, right? Than it is like, or it's sort of, pastiche is not the right word. It's not an Oz pastiche, but it's like, you know, like if you just knew a bunch of things about Oz, but hadn't looked at it in 20 years and then decided to recreate a story in that world, it's like that, right?
Yeah,
it's like this kind of fuzzy, like not quite thing. And that actually goes to one of my Chain Lightning things, so I'm not going to ruin that.
But yeah, I mean, I didn't feel alienated from it by that. I just recognized that there were things that I didn't know more about, but then I considered, I know, isn't there like something like a dozen books in the series, and I just thought, well, you know, that is not an investment I'm going to make. So yeah, right. So.
Yeah, there's a bunch. But all right, well, with all that said, let's go to the Chain Lightning round. Tom.
All of my Chain Lightning things are from the adventure prompts. So my first one is a thing that is needful but dangerous. Shoes that walk where you wish, but take you there alone.
The game acknowledges that even Baum wasn't consistent in how he presented Oz, and so you shouldn't worry about it too much either. And I like that as a world-building philosophy for this game.
On the list, Who Becomes Frightened, we have a rival asks the characters for shelter and discretion, which I think is great. Set up a rival first and then make them vulnerable. It really reveals character.
This is more of an in-practice thing, but Languidir of the 100 Faces is extremely fun to play.
On the table, Who Casts the Long Shadow? We have the deliciously creepy A Friend Thought Deceased, recrafted in leather and brass.
And I really liked the wild, cannibalistic, self-delimbing Scoodlers. They were incredibly fun to play. Let's go to the Expert Delve. It's the Expert Delve. All right, Tom, what are we talking about today?
Okay, the thesis statement for today is system equals setting and story.
Okay.
Good for alliteration, but it's not very helpful. So to be more explicit, it's the idea that mechanics are not neutral. So when we look at a rule system, it's going to define either the world that you're exploring. So for example, if someone plays a wizard, then it's a world that has at least one wizard in it, or it's going to define the kind of story you're telling. Your PC in Apocalypse World is a survivor if you want them to be. They can die like 3 times before they absolutely have to go. Whereas your character in a DCC funnel is not so much. And then for an example from Dark Designs, when you regain hit points by resting, you have to describe something from your past that haunts your dreams. So that's, as mentioned before, it brings story elements in very explicitly into the system. But I think that all systems affect story and setting in that way, and it's worth thinking about that when you are kind of deciding what game to play, and indeed when you're in the middle of the game.
Yeah, I agree completely. And it's a really interesting take. I mean, what I said earlier about one of the things I liked about Dark Designs is that how closely it ties the mechanics and the story, right? But in fact, a lot of games, conforming to your thesis here, a lot of games, they don't have to have that like really tight mechanical connection to still be doing that, right? Like you said, if you choose a wizard and you suddenly have all the wizard rules to have to engage with, you're saying a lot about the world, right? Mm-hmm. You're saying a lot about the setting, and that is system informing setting, and vice versa. So I think that's super, super cool. It's an interesting idea. How are some ways that we kind of see this play out in games? Like, what are some more examples of this?
Oh, man. I mean, I think, well, the most obvious, and actually, as we've mentioned earlier, read Dark Designs, it's your options when you're doing character creation. I think that's very fundamental, especially to the kind of story, because it's the definition of the main characters of our game.
Yeah, that's a great point. Dark Designs does this well, as I've noted. I think there are other games that do this in different ways, which are really interesting. Apocalypse World and its kin are great in this way. You know, in a lot of times in a lot of PBTA games, you have pick lists, right? Like, so you have your looks to choose from, you have your names, you have your various things that you pick from that help formulate the sort of core of your character. Sometimes even just the aesthetic of your character, right? But those lists do a lot of work, right? Like, they do a huge amount of work in terms of informing what this story is going to be about and what the flavor of this setting is going to be. And it is mechanical. Like the character creation process is, well, it's more procedural, I suppose, is probably a more accurate way of putting it. But, you know, it starts to get a little fuzzy between procedure versus mechanics, right? It's all kind of the same thing. Ultimately.
Yeah, that's why I hedged my bets and went for system instead of...
It is system, right? Like, it's system to choose from those pick lists to make your character in that way. And yeah, you're right. I mean, this feels, I don't know, maybe this is unfair, but this feels a little bit more modern to me. I don't think that you get quite the same experience in, say, building an old D&D character, where it was principally around rolling up stats, and the elements that you got to choose for your character were a little more far-flung or not so precisely defined, I guess.
I mean, that's true. I think maybe in the older style game, the options here tend to be more on the GM side, or what the players can negotiate with the GM. So like, this game's going to have bards in it or not. That's the thing about, for example, an Apocalypse World playbook. If you decide that your assistant at the medical clinic is called Toyota, nobody gets to veto that. That is your decision. And, you know, you've done it. You've defined your section of the world, that's definitely I'm going to say post-1990s at the very least, maybe more recent than that.
Well, there's another interesting thing here, too, that I want to point out. So there's this game that I play that I love called The Final Girl, and it's this troop-style horror movie game, right? And everyone has to create 3 or 4 characters that become part of a communal pool that everyone plays throughout the game. In creating the characters, you have a pretty rigid structure, right? They have to have a name, and then they have to have basically like a little sentence that follows a formula that says like who this character is and how they function in the story. And that's it. And then they have just these 3 basic traits that get developed as you play. But what I love about that is in the process of creating all those characters, you're saying a whole lot about what this story is going to be about. Just the mere fact that the characters are so tightly prescribed, it kind of leans into the genre of horror movies, which is that the characters are generally pretty, two-dimensional. They're not, not super well developed. They're all going to die. And so I think it's another interesting angle of like how the character creation process informs story and setting. So it's kind of cool.
And actually, Final Girl is a great example of the next thing in my kind of little mini list, which is the core mechanics, core and secondary mechanics, I guess. But basically what you do with the dice at the table or whatever. And of course, Final Girl is all about, there is mechanically, this is only going to go one way, which is down to one survivor of your horror movie. And as we know, like a PBTA game is, I don't want to get too stats based here, but basically you're generally shooting for a 7 or more on 2d6, which is roughly 64% likely to happen. So your odds are okay, but not amazing all the time. And you're varying that by what's at stake. Whereas in, say, kind of D&D based OSR, what you're looking at when you're changing mechanics is usually to do with, do you use this reaction table for the monsters or that? It has this kind of mix and match swapping around effect, but which still has a pretty powerful effect on what happens in your game. Substitute one random encounter table for another, and all of a sudden it's entirely different, right?
This idea of how the core mechanics are implicated in story and setting is a very, very interesting idea to me. There's another game I'm very fond of, another story game called My Life with Master. It's generally held up as the proto-example of a game that does one thing. Like, it does one thing, it tells one story. The mechanics tell one basic story, which is you are these servitors of this Dr. Frankenstein-like master. In the beginning, the Dr. Frankenstein master has a lot of power over the servants, and he makes them do terrible things. But as they go out into the village and make connections with people in the village and sort of gain some independence from him, they eventually mechanically, not just in the story, they mechanically get better and are able to resist the master more until finally the mechanics allow you to actually overthrow the master, right? And that goes the same way every time you play it. But you can see how it has a basic like narrative arc, which is pretty familiar if you're familiar with sort of classic monster movies. But the mechanics also get you there. Like in the beginning, you roll dice to resist the master, but you can't. Like, the whole point in the beginning is to roll the dice to see how you can't win, right? And like you roll just to see that you're bad and to see that the master is so much stronger, right? You could certainly, there's a version of that game where you could just be like, well, in the beginning, you can't resist the master. And that would be one way of doing it. But this game actually forces you to roll, even though you can't win.
And of course, it's a classic example of how making the mechanics literally about what the story is about. There's no strength, dexterity, or wisdom here. It's self-loathing, fear, and is there a positive one?
There's 3, I can't remember, or something like that. Yeah, but
like bang on the nose about what this is going to be about. It's not going to be about anything physical or whether or not you could climb over a wall. It's about your personal development, basically.
So core mechanics, character creation options. What else?
Yeah, related to that, you get setting books that are pretty mechanical, like Yoon Suin, which is essentially, in many ways, kind of a big collection of random tables. And then the secret is what's in those random tables, and that's what builds the whole setting. For listeners who haven't listened through the whole catalogue, I should say that Yoon Suin is a OSR supplement by David McGrogan from Noisms Press was the publisher anyway. And it's in a kind of fantasy world inspired by, let's say, northern India and Tibet more than where D&D would be inspired by Western Europe. And so it's really good, but it's not got a lot of artwork in it, and it doesn't have pages and pages of description. Instead, what it has is little entries, like describing in 1 or 2 paragraphs what you encounter as you travel through this place.
It's a terrific example here, too, because the number one criticism of Yoon Suin is that it does not have much art. And the other criticism, setting aside the art, which I don't think is a really informative of any particular point, but setting aside that, the other big criticism is that it's a huge setting book that doesn't have a lot of prose about the setting, right? It's probably got less than 20 paragraphs in all of its hundreds of pages of actual like prose detailing the setting. It's all in tables, right? And so it's all in tables that you roll on the fly as you play. And yeah, so this is a great example here. I will throw out that a game that listeners are going to be familiar with because I've been talking about a lot lately is Trophy. So Jesse and I are doing that standalone Trophy book. And one of the things we're doing is we're creating the world via crowdsourcing. And so what we're doing is we are picking a little element from the game and we are going to make a table, and we're asking people out on the internet, you know, fans of the game, to say, hey, help us like fill in the details of this table, right? The entire world of Trophy will be contained within these tables. There will be no text about it. It's all going to be in the tables. There's some, well, for one thing, there's some flexibility there so that you can kind of make the Trophy world that you wish, but also you can engage with it in a strictly mechanical way where you're just rolling things, right? And creating the world. And so, it's an interesting idea of world creation, obviously very, very rooted in the OSR. Yeah, it's exciting. I like it. Okay, good. That's an awesome point.
It is, and that nicely segues, in fact, to my last one, which is there are actually quite a lot of games, and I would say maybe that kind of midpoint, so like mid-80s into the 90s, you find quite a few games that sort of hide their setting inside the mechanics. And I think the classic example here is Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. In all its editions, but the one I know best is first edition. And that famously has a careers system where you sort of switch from being, say, a soldier, and then you might become a mercenary sergeant, or you might become a night watchman or something. And in fact, by reading through the careers that are there and reading through the skills that your character might get, so, you know, apprentices, mule skinners, which are the people that look after the animals on a long journey, the consume alcohol skill, that tells you what you really need to know about the world you're going to go and adventure in, way more than the reasonably well-written but quite long and involved Gazetteer of the Empire towards the back of the book. The real meat, the stuff you're actually going to engage with on a kind of session-to-session basis, that's all there in, you know, during character creation. And when you look up, how do I do this when I need to roll to, you know, not fall off a horse? I mean, I guess, I don't know if I have a substantive point about that, but I would say often reading the setting section is misleading, and you should be reading especially the character creation part of a game.
So what about some more practical applications here? And here I mean, like, you know, if you are going to design a game, I suppose, or if you're going to design a homebrew adventure, that sort of thing. How can we use this?
What do we do with this knowledge? Right, exactly. So I think the other thing is, if you're choosing which system you have an adventure you want to run, like, oh, what game am I going to do it in? Because as you know, we often, or at least I often, I don't know, use quote unquote the wrong game to play an adventure. Like, I believe in episode 1 of this very podcast, I suggested Nicotine Girls for Scenic Dunsmouth.
You did.
So,
yeah.
So that's another thing to consider this, this question.
Find the deepest ass cut possible and go with that.
Yeah, I think that's the best thing to do, right? Yeah. No, actually, no. I mean, that's not always true, because I often think about using Monster Hearts to play Keep on the Borderland, and I actually don't think that would work very well at all. But anyway, yeah, so I think step 1, just talk about basic mechanics, and I think you should consider matching the, you know, dice rolling or card drawing, if you're playing Castle Falkenstein, whatever, matching that to the feel that you want in your game. And you don't need to go like 100% maths nerd about it, but swinginess, for example, which is to say the distribution of different probabilities on a dice roll, that's a good thing to think about. So I want to give an example of the very good Traveller-esque OSR game, Stars Without Number. Now, Stars Without Number uses a 2d6 roll when you are just using your skills, like, you know, I need to go outside and fix the spaceship, but, you know, it's slightly under duress, so it's not that easy, but it's still a relatively controlled skill use. But when you get into fights, that switches to 1d20. And that means that life or death situations become much more chaotic and prone to extreme outcomes in either direction, compared to when your skilled professionals are just putting their training into practice. So that's something that seems like it's a neutral question. You know, do we use 2d6 or 1d20? But actually, it isn't. It's going to affect the general distribution of how things come out when you're making these dice rolls.
And here you mean, like, if you had in your hands a cool space-themed module or adventure, or you made up a space-themed module or adventure and you're trying to figure out what system to use for it, or you had one in hand and you wanted to figure out what system to use for it. That's what you're saying here, right? Like consider the lethality and the tone of the adventure.
If I want people to mostly miss their rolls and then suddenly kill the alien with a lucky shot, go for Mothership. But if you want it to be different, yeah. And I think people actually do this all the time. Like, not in a data-based way, but you just think, stuff like, I'm going to give the characters more hit points so they survive a bit more. This is a rule change that just kind of feels right when we did it. Like, we changed how shields worked in our D&D game. And that is just that's the right way to do it. If it kind of seems to be right for your game, it probably is,
Yeah, that actually makes a huge amount of sense. I mean, I talked about this in a previous episode. It was the one where we talked about Dead Planet. And I didn't use Mothership when I ran Dead Planet. I used that one by Chris Wolf, which Offworlders. Offworlders, yeah. I used Offworlders. And I had to make a lot of adjustments to the module because Offworlders assumes a bit more of like a kind of space exploration sort of adventure, right? And Dead Planet, especially that first sequence in Dead Planet, you're just fucking shooting lots of aliens, right? Like, it's a combat heavy alien shooting game, right? And it also has a lot of like baked in mechanics related to horror and things like that. And so, Offworlders maybe wasn't the best fit. Now, I'm a skilled enough GM to where I was able to make it work and I was still able to get everything I needed from Dead Planet, but it's definitely something to keep in mind. It's a consideration for sure. Also, this idea of mechanical or like swinginess in the outcomes, that's a really appealing idea to me. This is a little bit off topic, but in my game, The Between, which is in development, I'm very, very conscious of that in the rules. And the dice are set up, the core conflict resolution is set up so that it has that swinginess, right? So in The Between, you play Victorian monster hunters. They are these very posh Victorian era Londoners, right, who investigate serial killers and literal monsters. But the dice lead to two basic outcomes, right? Like your character ends up bleeding out to death in an alley, or because there are no hit points, it's just like basically fail states essentially, like you're alive or you're not, or they solve the mystery and the monster is defeated or the serial killer is arrested or whatever, right? It's resolved in like sometimes in one roll, there's not like a lot of back and forth combat. It's like this. It's like, okay, we do the thing, we roll the dice, and yeah, we did it. Awesome. And that swinginess is on purpose because these posh characters probably are not great at combat, right? They probably are not. I mean, if they encounter a fucking werewolf, they're probably going to get their innards spilled out on the sidewalk, right? They don't have a lot of chance, right? Like it just doesn't make any sense for them to be able to like battle, to fend off this physically overcome this werewolf, right? And so I'll just note that The Between has a sort of a backstop that makes it to where you can watch your character die, but they actually don't die. And I'm not going to get into it, but basically the swinginess, I agree with this. Like, I think that this is a really important consideration when you're thinking about the connection between mechanics and story, between mechanics and narrative beats, between mechanics and genre, right? Okay. So we just said a lot there. Is there anything else you want to say about, considering matching mechanics to feel?
When looking through systems, bear in mind that, or realize that you probably need way less at the table than Hasbro and its 700-page D&D would like you to believe, which works in two ways, right? So one is that a slim game may be perfect. For example, a 12-page Oz-based OSR game in a zine, like Dark Designs, or you can realize that you don't need to digest everything in a massive fat rule. But like, I don't need to read every career in Warhammer to play it. I just need to know about me and maybe my handful of companions, roughly what they do for a living. It's normally something menial, just panicked asking, does anyone know how to read and write? That kind of thing.
Right. Yeah, okay.
And that is enough. So like, what I'm trying to say, I think, is look at the systems you're assessing through the lens of what's actually going to happen in session one, not necessarily anything else.
Yeah. This idea of you don't need as much at the table as you might think, or as Hasbro thinks you need, is a really, really good point. I think, again, going back to Powered by the Apocalypse games, they're really good at this, right? Playbooks contain pretty much everything you need to know from a mechanical standpoint for your character. There's no flipping around in books or anything because it's all there on the 2 or 3 sheets, right? Same thing with like, it's got reference sheets for the moves that you use. Like, now it helps that it's a lighter game than, say, Pathfinder, right? Like it's, there are not grappling rules and that kind of thing, right? But I think that there's something to be said about the way it's presented and the way the materials are presented. It's in this very efficient manner to where, all you really truly need, for an Powered by the Apocalypse game at the table is just the play sheets. You 95% of the time you don't even need the book, right? Because it's all on the play sheets. And so, yeah, I'm very much down with that. And what I think is really interesting about this point, and I think why Dark Designs is such a great entree into this conversation, is kind of what I said earlier. Part of the reason why Dark Designs' 12 pages works to get a full gaming experience is because it has some assumptions baked into it, right? Despite everything Richard says about not needing to know anything to, about Oz or not knowing all the specifics, you still knowing something helps, right? And it helps you kind of fill in the world.
Yeah, it tells you some things that will change the complexion of your play as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So there's a range there, right? I mean, if you're playing something that's much more heavy and opaque or complicated as far as the setting goes, or new, very novel, you might need that big book, right? But at the table, your basic point is right. At the table, you may not need all that stuff.
Oh, yeah. I'm not saying you never need the big book,
right.
Or you might not ever want the big book, but during your, 3 hours, 4 hours of sitting with your friends, that only part of it is going to come into play. I want to come back to the mention of Dark Designs, though, because what got me on this whole line of thought was a little bit of box text in there, which says, before it gives you the adventure seed, says something along the lines of, you can use this to run adventures old and new. Yeah. And of course, that's the thing, right? As you know, one of my favorite things is to use the wrong system to run the right module. And I was imagining, what would it be like if I ran a normal subsurface environment, but with Oz dwellers going down there? And so that is an interesting question. How do we know which is the right, wrong system to match with other either adventures or other gaming resources? I mean, do you have any initial thoughts about that?
I'll just say that that little bit of, and it's a very tiny blink and you miss it bit of box text, is accurate though, because I think by session 3 of my run of Dark Designs, I think I was using a module. I'd pulled some stuff from a module. I can't remember which one it was, but I do that frequently, right? I kind of take the parts that I want. And I love that bit of advice. I almost included it in the things I liked portion of the show, but it's literally a sentence, right? So it felt a little bit overkill to make that a whole highlight, but you're right. To your point, Richard says in that little bit of box text, he says modules that are set in an urban environment or are underground. He doesn't say any module, right? He says modules that are set in an urban environment or that are set underground are a good fit for Dark Designs and Verdigris. And I think that's important, right? At a very basic level, you need to kind of make sure it fits, right? I don't know what that has to say about mechanics necessarily. I mean, I suppose you probably don't want to choose a module that has a lot of fiddly die rolls or makes a lot of assumptions about what system you're using and bakes that into its text. I'm not sure, but you might have to do a lot of converting if you pick the wrong module, right? But that's a kind of to your taste kind of question, I think. Some people love that. So
that, I think, is the key one. I think is this idea of matching themes in some way. So, of course, Oz is in an underground city, so underground things, city things work. When I ran Fever Swamp, I used Stay Frosty, which doesn't necessarily make sense on the face of it, except that I was doing that kind of swamps, kind of associated in the popular imagination with Vietnam War movies. When I think about kind of gung-ho American Marines, I think of the movie Aliens, and therefore I kind of combined those two things, and they worked out really well. I just had them being space Marines going around in a sort of high-tech hovercraft instead of fantasy adventurers in a canoe. Yeah,
we should note Stay Frosty is a kind of Space Marines OSR thing.
And it's also a good match because it has the mechanic for rising tension, which is this sort of psychological thing where as the tension level builds, your character gets more effective. But if it kind of, like blackjack style, goes over, then bad things happen. So that was a good match for the paranoid feel of Fever Swamp. The other point is that you can kind of create new story beats and kind of new elements of the setting by adding to the system. And then the example I'm thinking of right now, because I'm running Something Rotten in Kislev for Warhammer, which takes the characters out of their normal stomping grounds in the main setting of the game, and they go to what's essentially fantasy Russia. And there's an episode where they have to deal with these ancient kind of forest and farm spirits. And I mean, it's not a hugely complicated system. It's basically get a shaman to do a ritual and then they come and talk to you. But the fact is that this is system in the sense of how the cosmology of the world works. And it's something that is completely outside any previous experience of magic or weird spirits that the player characters would have had, because it only appears in this adventure. And it's great for that. Like, it really adds something totally different. It kind of restores that sense of wonder. You know, you've already got used to magic in general, but now you've got something that's alien again. And that, I think, is very interesting.
Well, this has been a really interesting conversation. This idea of system equaling setting and story. I would be curious to hear from listeners if you have any extra thoughts on games that do this particularly well, or maybe novel ideas for fits of mechanic to module, that kind of thing. So maybe go to our forums. That would be great. And let us know on the post for this show your ideas there. Is there anything else you want to say, Tom?
No, I'm good. Let's crack on.
It's the Companion Adventures. I only have a couple things. Why don't you start, Tom?
Sure. Well, I mean, we've already mentioned it, but I'm going to say here the film from 1985, Return to Oz. Now, okay, I'm mentioning this because if you have only seen The Wizard of Oz, you probably have a kind of brighter coloured and happier impression of Oz as a setting, whereas Return to Oz is disturbing and weird. Its production values are way lower than The Wizard of Oz, and to be honest, I don't know that it's that great a film, but allow me to illustrate how weird and creepy it is. Now, it came out in 1985, so I guess I would have been, 4 or 5, when I came into possession of the Return to Oz sticker album, with none of the stickers, just like the frames to put them in, and then the little captions telling you the story.
I remember this, yeah.
Now, my mum told me not to read it because it was too scary. Because I was a young idiot, I ignored her, got through about 2 pages. There's a bit where the chicken kind of dies suddenly because it steps onto the sand in the desert. Freaked me out. I was kind of, terrified and bawling my head off, as I recall. Anyway, for some reason I went back to it, then got terrified by the wheelers, who are people who have wheels instead of hands and feet. Came back, I'm sure, weeks later, maybe I'll just read a bit more, then got freaked out by people's decapitated heads being kept on shelves. Basically, it's an absolute nightmare. So yeah, check it out.
Yeah, absolutely. If you have a child who's 7, 8, 9 years old, go watch this with them immediately. Every child needs to be exposed to this. While you're there, watch Dark Crystal and Labyrinth and other, or the one where the horse sinks in the swamp. That I can't think of the name right now. The German one. Never-ending Story.
Yes.
Your children deserve to have these formative experiences like Tom and I did, so go do it. No, Return to Oz is great because I think it is a little bit more close in tone to what Dark Designs and Verdigris is trying to do than regular Wizard of Oz. And furthermore, Dark Designs has some elements from Return to Oz that have a familiarity there between the two of them. So 2 of the bosses in Dark Designs are Princess Langwidere and Mombi, and those are characters from the Oz books as well. And in Return to Oz, those 2 characters are kind of smashed into one, right? In Princess Mombi, and so you kind of get some role playing notes, I think. And indeed, when I played Princess Langwidere, I definitely based it off the Princess Mombi character in Return to Oz, the way I RP'd it. Also, the Scoodlers. You mentioned the Wheelers. The Scoodlers are pretty clearly the Wheelers, right? They're just a more horrifying version of the Wheelers, right? And so, yeah, Return to Oz is a great pick. I was going to choose it as well, so it's kind of both our picks in a way. You have a video game recommendation. What is it?
Yeah, I do. It's one of the Telltale games, so it's not actually that interactive. It's sort of a choose-your-own-adventure game. It's called The Wolf Among Us, and it has the main character is the big bad wolf from fairy tales, but he's now the policeman in the fairy tale character's slum, I think in New York or something. And it has this great aesthetic design to it, but also this feeling of just general glumness and faded glory. They all used to live in Storyland and then they had to flee and everything sucks now. It's slightly uneven in quality, but I think if you just played the first episode of it, you'd get the idea, and that would do. And quickly to follow up, I have another computer game, kind of. It's a browser game called Fallen London, which was previously had a different title that now escapes me. But anyway, it's set in, well, the idea is that London fell into the earth and is now a weird alternate reality Victoriana thing. It's a little bit kind of more whimsical than Dark Designs, I would say, but it has a lot of that kind of thing going on. Different factions with bosses getting you to do stuff, exploring ruins, generally being peculiar. It's worth checking out, and I believe it's free.
Why don't you go and just finish up? You have a song as well, right?
Oh yeah, well this is, I don't know how valuable this recommendation is. It might be the end credits music for your game. It's a song called Oh My by Melody Sheep. I'll have to stick the YouTube link in the show notes, but basically this person has taken clips from The Wizard of Oz and assembled them into a montage with pitch shifting where required to make it into a kind of Lana Del Rey electro dream pop song. And it's a bit of an earworm. Yeah, check it out.
She'll have to give that a listen. I just have two things. Also Return to Oz, but two other things. I've mentioned it a couple times. This technique called establishing questions. The core idea is certainly not something I created. I'm not sure anyone can say they've created the idea of posing questions to players, but I certainly created the taxonomy and the terminology that people use, and it's called establishing questions, and it's in a blog post that I wrote a few years ago, and I recommend reading it because it's one really good, solid strategy for getting players hooked into the premise of your story or the premise of the game that you're going to play pretty quickly. It's especially helpful if you only have a few sessions and you need to kind of get to the good stuff really quickly. In a longer term campaign, you don't really have to do this so much because you've got 15 sessions, under your belt that informed a lot of like what came, where the characters are at and what their motivations are. But if you only got a few sessions, or if you're playing in a setting or in a game with a very like slim setting material, kind of like Dark Designs, you do need some kind of way of getting the players hooked into that. And I think that establishing questions is a great way of doing that. We'll include a link in the show notes. We won't. We say that every week, but we never do. Just Google it. And then finally, I want to recommend a thing that you may not be able to get when this comes out. It might be have it just come out by the time this releases, but it'll definitely be out shortly after this releases, if not. It is in Codex Childhood, the upcoming issue of our zine, and it is the next expansion of this game. It's called Electric Daylight in Verdigris, and it features a new character creation option where you can create a phantasm, which we didn't talk about much this episode. We just mentioned them briefly, but you can create your own phantasm character. They're pretty cool. You can go check it out yourself. And then also it sort of begins the fleshing out of Verdigris as a setting. And so it has several pages on this particular location in Verdigris, this library and all the different things that are in this library. And it's another 10 or 11 pages or so for the game. And we'll probably continue to build out Verdigris in Codex in the same way, kind of like we do with Trophy. And that's our show. Listeners, if you want to get in touch with us, there's several different ways you can do that. We're a production of The Gauntlet, so you can hit us up on Twitter at GauntletRPG. We have a website. It's gauntlet-rpg.com. We have the forums, and every time a new episode goes up, we post about it on the forums, and so you can go and chat about the episode on our forums. It's forums.gauntlet-rpg.com. And we are on Patreon if you'd like to support the show financially. It's patreon.com/gauntlet. Tom, thanks so much.
Jason, thank you. And thank you to our excellent editor, Lou Quaid.
All right, listeners, have a good one.
My mum told me not to read it because it was too scary.